Welcome, travelers, to Adventures in Security. In this video, we explore how to ensure that an organization's contract with a CSP includes all necessary elements to help protect the organization's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Also included are considerations to protect PII privacy and maintain regulatory compliance. You can download the video script, including the bibliography, from the link in the description. Learning objectives. In this video, we are looking at the customer CSP contract as the operating system for the relationship between a customer and a cloud service provider. Many people think the contract is mainly about price and maybe uptime, but in practice it is where the parties allocate risk, define security expectations, describe how data will be handled, and decide what happens if something goes wrong. For this presentation, think of the contract as a package, not a single document. In cloud arrangements, the full agreement often includes the master services agreement, the service level agreement, privacy terms, security commitments, acceptable use terms, and sometimes separate data processing or compliance addenda. That matters because obligations are often scattered across multiple documents, and a weak attachment can undermine a strong main agreement. Our goal is simple: identify the critical contract elements, then explain how regulatory requirements, industry expectations, and geographic location can change what must be negotiated. What the contract must accomplish. A strong customer CSP contract has to accomplish 5 things. First, it must clearly define the service, what is being provided, what is out of scope, and which party is responsible for which tasks. Second, it must establish measurable performance and support expectations. Third, it must protect the customer's data, systems, and confidential information. Fourth, it must allocate liability and identify what remedies exist if the provider misses commitments or causes harm. Fifth, it must explain how the relationship ends, including what happens to customer data. NIST Cloud Guidance is helpful here because it treats cloud agreements as a bundle of service arrangements. It explains that a cloud agreement typically includes an SLA, privacy policy, acceptable use policy, and terms of use, and that the agreement should address the service period, termination, and data disposition. That is a practical reminder that contract review cannot stop at the signature page. You have to inspect every incorporated document and every provider policy that the contract pulls in by reference. Core commercial terms. The commercial section gives the contract its shape. Start with the parties and the definition of authorized users, because unclear party language can create disputes about who may use the service and who is bound by the terms. Then define scope. Is the provider delivering SaaS, PaaS, IaaS, managed services, or a combination? The answer affects responsibility boundaries and support obligations. Pricing terms should explain not only the fees, but also usage metrics, overages, billing intervals, tax treatment, and the mechanics for service credits. The terms section should address initial term, renewals, notice windows, termination for cause, termination for convenience, if available, and suspension rights. Suspension language deserves special attention because some providers reserve broad rights to suspend service. Finally, include change control and an order of precedence clause. Cloud providers often update online policies. If the contract allows unilateral policy changes, the customer may accept new obligations without real negotiation. NIST specifically warns that some public cloud offerings permit the provider to modify terms by posting updates online. That is why customers should define which documents control and whether material changes require notice, consent, or a termination right. Service levels support resilience and operations. An SLA should convert business expectations into measurable operational commitments. That means stating uptime targets, performance measures, where relevant, support hours, severity definitions, and response and resolution targets. It should also identify planned maintenance windows and how much notice the provider must give before changes that could affect the customer's operations. Resilience also belongs here. If the service is important, the customer should ask about backup frequency, recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives, failover expectations, and whether disaster recovery testing occurs. Promises are not enough. The contract should define evidence, reporting, and remedies. NIST describes the SLA as the document that captures the expected level of service and the compensation available if the provider fails to meet that level. That last point is important. Remedies should be meaningful. If the only remedy is a small service credit capped at a low percentage of fees, the SLA may not adequately address business harm. For critical workloads, customers often need escalation rights, repeated failure termination rights, and obligations for corrective action plans. Security, privacy, and data governance. Security and privacy clauses are where a cloud contract becomes operationally serious. The customer should require the CSP to maintain an appropriate security program and align it to a recognized framework. NIST CSF 2.0 is useful here because it frames cybersecurity as a risk management issue and provides a taxonomy of outcomes rather than a one-size-fits-all checklist. When personal data is involved, the privacy terms should say what data is processed, for what purpose, who may access it, how long it is retained, and what happens at the end of the relationship. Under GDPR, Article 28, processor relationships must be governed by a contract that describes the subject matter and duration of processing, the nature and purpose of processing, the type of personal data, the categories of data subjects, and the controller's rights and obligations. Article 28 also requires documented instructions, confidentiality, appropriate security measures, assistance with data subject rights, deletion or return of data at the end of services, and audit support. In plain English, the contract should answer 4 questions: who owns the data, who may use it, how it is protected, and how it comes back or gets destroyed. Assurance, subprocessors, incidents, and audit rights. Customers should not rely on marketing statements for assurance. The contract should say what audit artifacts the provider will provide, such as SOC reports, penetration test summaries where appropriate, or compliance attestations. It should also state how quickly the provider must remediate material findings. Subprocessors are another major issue. If the CSP uses other vendors, the customer needs visibility into who they are, what they do, and how obligations flow down. GDPR Article 28 is very clear here. A processor may not engage another processor without prior specific or general written authorization, and the same data protection obligations must be imposed on that subprocessor. Incident response language should define what counts as a security incident, how fast notice must be given, what information the provider must share, and what cooperation it owes during investigation, containment, recovery, and regulatory response. In regulated sectors, notification timing may be especially sensitive. Finally, write the shared responsibility model into the contract. If security tasks are divided between customer and provider, the division should be explicit. Ambiguity in a shared responsibility model is one of the fastest ways to create blame shifting after an incident. Liability, indemnity, IP, confidentiality, and insurance. This is the risk transfer slide. Liability clauses determine how much financial exposure each side carries. Providers often want a low cap tied to fees paid, while customers usually seek higher caps or carve-outs for confidentiality breaches, data protection failures, gross negligence, willful misconduct, and infringement claims. These negotiations matter because security and privacy failures can generate regulatory, litigation, and business interruption costs that exceed subscription fees by a wide margin. Indemnities are also essential. Customers typically look for IP infringement indemnities and, depending on the deal, indemnities tied to the provider's misconduct or non-compliance. Confidentiality clauses should protect business information, security documentation, and any regulated data shared during the relationship. Intellectual property terms should distinguish between provider-owned platform IP, customer data, customer configurations, and derived outputs if analytics or AI features are involved. NIST Cloud Guidance explicitly notes that terms of use often address licensing, limitations on liability, and modifications to terms, and warns that privacy and security risks depend heavily on the service agreement. That is why these clauses should be reviewed by business, legal, and security stakeholders together, rather than in isolation. How regulation changes the contract. Regulation changes the contract by turning preferred language into required language. Under GDPR, a controller using a processor must include specific Article 28 terms, and international data transfers may require standard contractual clauses when data moves to a third country without an adequacy basis. The GDPR also applies extraterritorially in some cases, including where goods or services are offered to people in the EU. In California, the CCPA, as amended by the CPRA, affects how businesses, service providers, contractors, and third parties structure personal data relationships. California's official materials explain that CPRA amendments added new rights that began January 1, 2023. California's statute also requires agreements when personal information is disclosed to service providers, contractors, or third parties for limited and specified purposes. California's rulemaking has continued, and the CPPA announced additional regulations taking effect January 1, 2026, with phased compliance for some topics. The lesson is that contracts need a compliance maintenance mechanism, the right to update addenda, require reasonable cooperation, and revise security or privacy schedules when the law changes. Otherwise, a contract that was compliant at signing can become outdated during the term. How industry changes the contract. Industry overlays can be just as important as general privacy law. In healthcare, if protected health information is involved, the parties may need business associate terms and detailed security and breach cooperation provisions. HHS explains that the HIPAA security rule addresses covered entities, protected information, and the safeguards required to protect electronic protected health information. For payment environments, PCI DSS drives control allocation, evidence requests, segmentation expectations, and incident handling. PCI-SSC's current document library shows PCI DSS v. 4.0.1 as the active published standard. In education, FAIRPAW brings student privacy obligations that can affect access, redisclosure, and institutional governance. In financial services, the FTC's Safeguards Rule requires covered financial institutions under FTC jurisdiction to maintain an information security program and address service provider oversight. In the federal space, FedRAMP adds another layer: standardized cloud security assessment expectations, baselines, and documentation, with current FedRAMP materials aligned to NIST SP 853 Rev 5. So one contract template does not fit every sector. The same cloud platform may need different appendices, audit rights, and reporting obligations depending on whether the customer is a hospital, retailer, university, bank, or federal agency. How location changes the contract. Location matters in at least three ways. First, it determines governing law, venue, and dispute mechanics. Second, it affects where data may be stored, accessed, or transferred. Third, it triggers local regulatory obligations, such as privacy rights, security expectations, or sector-specific requirements. The GDPR is a strong example, because it can apply even when the provider is not established in the EU if the processing relates to offering goods or services to people in the Union. Once data crosses borders, transfer mechanisms matter, and the EU's standard contractual clauses are designed to support lawful transfers to third countries. California is another reminder that location can drive consumer rights obligations even for companies headquartered elsewhere if they do business involving California residents' data. For multinational customers, the practical answer is modular drafting. Use a core agreement for universal terms Then attach region-specific schedules for privacy, transfers, public sector clauses, or national security requirements. That approach is usually more sustainable than trying to squeeze every jurisdictional rule into one generic paragraph. In other words, geography is not just a legal footnote. It changes architecture, operations, and contract design. Exit, transition, and the final checklist. A good cloud contract is not complete until exit is addressed. Customers should ask, if we terminate, how do we get our data back? In what format? At what cost? And by when? The agreement should also say when the provider deletes remaining copies, whether deletion is certified, and how backups are handled. If the service is critical, transition assistance may be necessary so the customer can migrate to another provider without operational disruption. NIST Cloud Guidance specifically points to termination, data preservation, and disposition as core service agreement topics. It also recommends reaffirming contractual obligations at closeout, revoking access rights, and recovering organizational resources and data. GDPR, Article 28, reinforces this by requiring the processor, at the controller's choice, to delete or return personal data at the end of the services, unless law requires retention. Here's the final checklist question I teach students to ask. Can the customer leave safely? If the answer is unclear, the contract is incomplete. Strong cloud contracting is not only about getting into the service successfully, it is also about ensuring security, compliance, continuity, and leverage throughout the relationship and at the point of exit. That's it for this video. If you learned anything, please remember to give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And until next time, be careful what you click.